The Jim Jordan hearings in the House, Republican attorneys general are suing tech companies. It's all scaring other companies like Facebook, in particular Meta, who had at least sort of made gestures to caring about this because they were concerned about basically drawing regulatory interest in Washington. Now they see far more cost in antagonizing Republicans than there is upside in staving off regulations.
Hello and welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm Tim Miller. Well, we have a rematch. Officially, we've all known this, but President Biden and former President Trump have both officially won enough delegates as of last night to be the presumptive nominees for the party. Remember, it's Wednesday, so if you want hot political takes on that, head on over to the Next Level feed. I am here today with a very smart political mind himself, old friend, Sasha Issenberg. He is an author and journalist. His brand new book is The Lie Detectives: In Search of a Playbook for Winning Elections in the Disinformation Age. You might remember Sasha, he wrote The Victory Lab in 2012 about the Obama data nerds, and he also wrote a magnum opus about gay marriage called The Engagement. We might do some gay stuff at the end. Sasha, thanks for doing this, brother.
Thanks for having me, Tim. Great to be with you.
Before we get to your book, any big grand thoughts about Joe Biden, Donald Trump, part deux, and how we got here?
I mean, the one thing that, just as somebody who's dreading just the kind of soul-crushing nature of this election season we have in front of us, that maybe got me excited.
Listen to the Bulwark Podcast more. That's how you can handle the crushing dread,
Was like Trump's comments about social entitlement programs on CNBC this week, which just like, it was this glimmer of return to old politics. Like maybe we'll just have, stupid Democratic demagoguery on entitlement cuts like we grew up with, instead of some of the other insanity. But it was like a porthole back to campaigns in 1996. What might come of that? So
the
moderately
other funny
optimistic
thing about that CNBC interview that you're referencing, so Trump was on Squawk Box the other day, which is when he appeared open to entitlement cuts, which is crazy, which is very un-Trumpy. It's like, was his one of his insightful lizard brain things was that he was the one Republican in 2016 who wasn't supporting entitlement reform. So it was a strange strategic choice for him. But the other interesting thing back to old politics about that interview was like why he was doing it, which is that he needs money.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And like in the past, Trump has been outspent in every campaign. But they're in such dire financial straits right now. And the RNC had to cut 60 people. Trump's, the money is being repurposed to his various legal entities. And so like he's on CNBC because he needs rich guys to give him money.
And the other, data point in that this week is that his apparent sort of flip-flop on TikTok was driven by Jeff Yass, the Republican mega donor and Club for Growth guy who had been sort of slow to come into the fold and is now sort of ready to put up money. He also owns 15%, I think, of ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, and hired Kellyanne Conway. And by all accounts, Trump went from being an anti-TikTok guy to a pro-TikTok guy overnight to placate a large donor, which is another part of at least the mythology on this around Trump in 2016 was I don't owe anybody anything because I fund my own campaigns, which was not entirely true. But I do think was, part of what seemed to make him a different type of political figure. And now I wonder if we're in a season where he's going to do sort of more conventional rich guy bidding. And we see that on not just in terms of where he does his interviews, but on policy changes as well.
Yeah, I mean, the swampiness of it is maybe more of a vulnerability for him than the TikTok policy change itself, right? I mean, literally, he's got Kellyanne Conway's being paid by, a company. This is like classic swampy stuff.
And this is it's the rare example of a kind of lobbying story that could break through to news just because the TikTok thing is relatable, because the China angle is something that sort of plays so well into Trump's politics, because Kellyanne Conway is a famous household name. Like all of it is the rare thing where some of these other stories that we've read in the Times or the Washington Post, that some donor who once went to Mar-a-Lago got like a sub-agency at a cabinet to do this thing. It was always so arcane. This is actually kind of graspable, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I want to talk more about TikTok in a minute, but why don't you just give people the elevator pitch on the lie detectives, so we can get into, I think a lot of really sort of important externalities and an ever changing thing. I guess were you a little bit concerned to make this a book, given how quickly things are changing? Why don't
Yeah,
you
and
kind of tell people about that and about the premise of the book?
I made it a short, fast book, both in sort of how quickly I turned it around and how quickly it is to read, which I believe my last one gave you a hernia, Tim. So
It
I'm trying
did.
to,
It
I'm trying to,
did.
think of this as corrective surgery.
Thank God it was during COVID, because I was just like, really, Sasha? 812 pages? I don't know how many pages it actually was. I mean, I like
pretty
gay
close.
marriage as much as the next guy, but it was a little much for me at my TikTok brain.
So this one you can read in an afternoon. What we've heard a lot about disinformation and its place in our politics since 2016. It's obvious in some respects it's been a sort of like dominant subplot to almost everything that has happened in our politics. Certainly all the stuff around the 2020 election, January 6th, COVID response. And I think we've all heard a lot about what the threat is to democracy, about how it's used as a geopolitical tool. I think we've read a lot about what the platforms, the social media companies are or are not doing. The one thing that seemed to be missing was, what does it mean if you are inside of a campaign? And that could be a candidate's campaign or a party committee or a super PAC. And you're in this new environment where your opposition is not your opponent. It's not the other candidate. It's not the other party, but is somebody who is spreading stuff about you online, whose name you probably don't know because they're, an anonymous meme maker in their basement, or they belong to a foreign intelligence service, or they're somebody who has figured out how to make a buck selling ad clicks on to fake websites. And the whole playbook that folks like you came up, sort of were raised with about how you think about communications, what you say, when you say, where you say it, what you choose to respond to, what you don't respond to. That was all shaped in an era of television, big central newspapers, where the candidates were the loudest voice for their campaigns, and we're no longer in that environment. And so this book was my effort to sort of explore what the smartest people in politics are thinking about how you run campaigns in this media environment.
All right. So just before we get to 2024, let's go back a little bit to where this starts. So the book starts after 2016. You'd written, I guess, in October with somebody I talked to a couple months ago, Josh Green, who's also got another really good new book out about the left and the populist left. And you guys wrote about Trump's anti-democratic, the voter suppression tactics, and how they aimed it at three groups that Hillary needed to win. Kind of idealistic white liberals who thought maybe she was too swampy, younger women, and black voters. There was a lot of particular interest in what they did with black voters. And so talk a little bit about that. And this was maybe a proto effort, but there was a lot of focus on what was happening in the Russian side of things. But the Trump campaign was using some pretty interesting is maybe the nicest way to put it, tactics in 2016 that the other side really wasn't.
Yeah. So my book, The Victory Lab, came out in 2012, and it was about all these innovations in campaigns, especially involving new data that was available that allowed campaigns to profile voters and sort of tailor their contact with them. And it was a largely happy story about politics. It was campaigns were investing in things like training volunteers to knock on doors because they could be more targeted and efficient with it. They were becoming, the communication you were getting from campaigns was more likely to address the issues you cared about, because campaigns no longer felt like they had to communicate with 50% of the electorate at one time. They could dig in on small groups of interest. Voter turnout has gone up in the 21st century. And I sort of argued that part of that was because campaigns were focusing on GOTV in a new way. And so this was a happy story. And
it was literally about engaging new people and getting new people involved in the process. And that was the whole premise of what the Obama data operation was.
And I've had a lot of reason in the 12 years since to worry that I was naive about that.
Welcome to the club.
Yes. So, I wrote very little about the internet, but obviously so much of what we see about new technology and campaigns over the last decade seems like people using it as a force for ill in a way that I did not anticipate. And that really crystallized when Josh Green and we spent several days in San Antonio with the Brad Parscale led Trump digital operation. And there was that moment that, as you quote, where we quoted a senior Trump campaign official talking about these voter suppression efforts that they had underway and how they were using Facebook dark posts to target them at those sort of specific demographic groups you mentioned. And it was the first time I had personally encountered somebody using the language of sophisticated, modern, data-driven campaigning to drive voters away from the process, actively confuse them, and clearly, what's happened in the 7 or 8 years since has given me all the more reason I think that was not an anomaly. That there are that one, social media does lend itself to sort of efforts to confuse or mislead people, and that created all these avenues for bad actors. I mean, not like Gary Busey, but like bad actors to get involved in our political process. And what was interesting to me is like, what does that mean when you're on the other side of it, right? Can you run if you're Joe Biden or you're the DNC or you're Nikki Haley and you're up against folks who are playing by a new set of rules or no rules at all, what does that mean for you?
And Biden team did learn a little bit about this in 2020, and actually, sort of they weren't blindsided by it, at least. And so talk about kind of what they learned and how they decided to deal with the efforts in 2020, which, just to be clear, I think it's going to be kind of patty cake compared to what we've got coming over the next 8 months. But talk about their 2020 efforts and how they decided to engage or not engage on some of the disinformation side of things.
Yeah, so in the summer of 2020, I mean, Biden was blessed with a couple of things that most campaigns don't have: a lot of money and relatively speaking, a lot of time. And so they invested in this sort of massive research project to identify what bits of disinformation were, and this is a quote from Rob Flaherty, who's now the deputy campaign manager, market moving. And their view was, yes, lots of people are going to be online every day making up and spreading lies about Joe Biden. And, maybe not things that are outright lies, but things that are misrepresentations or attacks that are going to move virally instead of moving through TV ads. And probably the smart thing to do in 97% of the cases is ignore them, because they're not reaching a lot of people. They're not reaching a lot of people who might ever vote for Joe Biden. I mean, so much of the sort of trash online is Trump supporters flattering each other by coming up with crazy stuff that they use to gin one another up, but is not actually sort of a strategic threat. And they wanted to really be focusing on things that were what Flaherty calls a 50+1 problem. Is this going to make us harder to win the votes we need to win? And if not, I quote him saying, okay, this might be a problem for democracy. This might be a problem for our society, but it's not a problem for us as the Biden for president campaign day to day. And this was a really tricky problem for politicians, especially on the left after 2016, because so many of them couldn't really separate their worry about disinformation as a geopolitical or social problem from their self-interest, hour to hour, day to day running for office. And there was this, I think, sort of resistance era instinct among well-meaning people that was like, and this manifests itself in all sorts of anti-Trump politics. Like, we have to do something.
Right.
And the thing about online disinformation is that often doing something is totally the wrong answer, right? So there's a kind of Streisand effect, which is like you draw attention to stuff that maybe is not getting a big audience by paying attention to it. Two, the whole structure of social media is built to reward engagement. So if you are responding to a lie to fact check it or debunk it or sass it or whatever, you are helping to drive eyeballs to it. And then the third part, which is a little more nuanced, is, and you know this, Tim, as a campaign professional, like every day you have things that you want to accomplish. You want to make the news about X. You are using all the tools at your disposal to do that. You have a limited capacity to drive attention towards your priorities. You want to communicate with your supporters. You want to win over persuadable voters. You want to communicate with your donors. And if you spend every day responding to what somebody else is putting in front of you, you're not going to be doing the proactive communications. And so the Biden folks, that was sort of the framework that they brought to this.
This is also different. I mean, there's some parallels between comm strategy, right? You'd think about this as a PR, from a PR side, like, are you going to respond to this attack or not? But in an advertising space, this is really new. I just like to put a finer point on this. Like, it was not the case in 2010. If your opponent was on TV with an ad accusing you of something that's false or hyperbolic, and that, like, it was not, there wasn't really a should we respond to this or should we not, right? It was like, you kind of had no choice but to, because, like, this is the channel. There's just one big channel, and it's TV ads during the 6 o'clock news or whatever. And so, unless you thought it was a dumb attack, which I guess happened occasionally, but most of this was based in polling and based in research, like, you had to respond to it.
But
right?
and you guys had a just sort of, both you could quantify and you had an innate understanding about what volume and reach of the attack meant, right? So they put 200
you could
points.
Literally quantify it. Like, they would tell you how many points have they got, how many
you would know
impressions.
In a campaign, okay, they put 200 points and it's on the 6 p.m. news. That means one thing. They put 1,000 points and it's running on prime time. That gives you a sense of whom it's reaching. Is this, did this make it on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, or is it stuck on B12 in a small story? That'll shape how much of a problem it is for you. Is this getting traction on talk radio? Like, you knew, you had a mental map of the media environment and just instinctively knew what was breaking through and what wasn't. Yeah. And, we don't have, some social media platforms are more transparent than others, but still the basic question of who is seeing this, whom is this reaching, is just like not, doesn't translate well. I mean, so even we see stuff like, 100,000 people view this. Do they live in the state that you're running in? Right. Do they live in the country that you're running in?
Is it a real view?
Are they over 18 years old? Can they vote? Are they, a bunch of people who will never support you or will always support you? These are really difficult technical questions to solve, given how opaque the social media platforms choose to be. And so the whole playbook that folks in your generation, not to make you feel old, like, worked from doesn't translate to digital media this way. And so what the Biden folks wanted to do was think less about, their take was that campaigns, sort of, especially post 2016, when there was a focus on this in the US, were thinking about disinformation as a supply side problem. So in their view, we looked at a particular piece of content, and it could be a deepfake video, it could be a Twitter post that had a false claim in it, it could be a conspiracy theory, whatever. And campaigns were inclined to play whack-a-mole with those as they popped up. So they did their best with the data that they had to determine who is this reaching, and, like, is it moving, trending quickly or slowly, and then respond to each one as it came along. And maybe that was pushing back in a kind of traditional comms way. Maybe that was going to the platforms to try to get it taken down. But their view was that was the wrong way to think about this. And that it was better to think of this, as they said, as a demand side problem. Well, what does that mean? It means the stuff that is going to cause a problem for Biden, the stuff that's going to stick and change opinions, is stuff that responds to existing doubts, concerns, anxieties that voters have. And let's identify what those are so that we can anticipate which of these viral narratives actually have the power to move people. And so they did this big opinion research project starting in the summer of 2020. And they used some of the data that was being collected about which viral narratives were moving online. So at the time, this included, and they used Trump shorthand a lot for this because he's good at that. So Sleepy Joe, right, that he's old and mentally diminished. Creepy Joe, we hear a lot less about this one these days, but the idea that
hair sniffing, remember?
Yeah,
they tried to make a thing out of that.
Handsy with young women. Stuff about Kamala Harris, both sort of narratives that she was too far to the left and too far to the right on criminal justice issues. They made up a couple, they called them red herrings, just to put them in the poll to kind of create a baseline of what people would say that they responded to. One of them was Joe Biden belongs to an all-white country club, which is in no way true, but they pulled it just to get a sense of what people would say yes to regardless.
Yeah.
And then they asked two questions. One, are you familiar with this? And two, would it make you less likely to vote for Joe Biden? And they mapped this on a graph, and they had two axes, one of which showed the reach, how many people had heard this, and the other one showed how potentially damaging it was in terms of people whose opinions would be changed. And what they found was, for example, the Hunter Biden corruption stuff, a lot of people by getting into the fall of 2020 had heard about this. They were familiar with these
I'm sorry, Sasha. I'm sorry. I've got to interrupt you there. That is not possible because the social media companies stifled the Hunter Biden story and the Hunter Biden laptop, and this was an election interference effort by the big tech and the deep state and the Illuminati. I've heard about
told
this
that, yes.
I've seen several Republican oversight hearings that were premised on this. That one of the reasons why Joe Biden won is because this was silenced. So
as it happens, even before the laptop, this was the subject of an impeachment of Donald Trump. Stuff had broken through.
Okay.
But this was sort of revealed through focus groups. It actually wasn't. So a lot of persuadable voters had heard this. They were familiar with it. But it didn't actually make them less likely to vote for Joe Biden because his focus group showed they did not think that
Hunter Biden and they're different.
Well, yes. They would not vote for Hunter Biden. Yes. They did not see Biden as motivated by personal financial interests. So they'd heard all of it, but it didn't actually change their views of him. But the Sleepy Joe stuff did affect them. Why? Not because they were actually, and this came through in the focus groups, concerned about Biden's physical fitness. They saw Biden as this fundamentally weak political figure. I think probably a lot of this has to do with being defined as vice president, sort of the way he stumbled through a big fields in the Democratic primaries without ever really being the main character. And what the voters' doubts, as I quote one pollster saying, were that Biden would not be the author of his presidency. They saw weakness. They didn't really know what he stood for. They worried he would be controlled by other people in the White House. And that manifests itself in being more receptive to stuff about his age and mental fitness. And so for the campaign's perspective, the comms department, the folks who schedule what Joe Biden does in front of cameras every day, had been pushing stuff like, let's do photo ops of him on a bicycle so people will see that he's fit and energetic. Let's have him run up the stairs to his plane. And the research
those ideas seem to have backfired a little bit.
He slipped one or two times, which literally, back heel fire. But they also didn't really, what this research project showed was they didn't really address what voters were worried about. They weren't worried that he couldn't ride a bike or walk. They had this deeper worry about his political presence. And so the solutions they came up with in some way are sort of banal, but they started buying ads against social media searches. So if you went on Google and searched for Biden and senile, you would probably be pushed to an ad, a 15-second ad that showed Biden speaking to camera, seemingly unedited, talking about what he wanted to do on the economy. And that was the stuff that seemed to the group of voters who were worried about the age issue. That was actually the thing that was the most persuasive to them. And so they thought of this as avoiding the problem of drawing attention to the actual claim by attacking the underlying anxieties.
So now we fast forward to this time, and the Sleepy Joe stuff is going to be even more of a concern for people because I think he's older. He's old.
I cover math and politics.
Yeah, Tim, every day he's one day older. This is something we've mentioned quite a few times on the Bulwark podcast. And so we've got that. So now you're kind of combining both, right? There are some people who still perceive him as a weak political leader. I think that there are ways, to me, like that seems easier to combat this time. And you sort of see that with their opening ad talking about how he did infrastructure week, right? And like the other guy's also old and talked about how he wanted to do it every week and didn't do it. I do think that like unable to get things done week, this time it feels to me like that's the easier problem to solve. And so it's kind of the inverse of 2020, where it's the other problem, the age, the fitness, the mental acuity, and you're already seeing this. I mean, I don't have full access to everything that's happening on the internet, but just casually, like looking through my TikTok, my other social media feeds, like you see these Joe Biden old mashups. Trump put out some meme where he's going to the Visiting Angels retirement home. How does that look this time as compared to 2020?
Yeah, I mean, I think it obviously is a more immediate concern now, and Biden is more of a focal point of this campaign than he was in 2020 when obviously Trump was in office and for a variety of reasons, COVID, so I think the big thing that I think that there's this, often folks will look at the campaign and say, they're not responding to X or Y that is getting a lot of attention on TikTok or on Facebook. And obviously we do see, and he started, as you suggest, that ad by saying, hey, I'm not a young guy anymore, whatever the line is. So they are being a little more direct than they were about this in 2020 when they, I think, did not want to, when the thinking of the communications was, let's do a lot of things that are, under the waterline addressing this, but not actually, put age in the headlines every day. Now I think that they realize that is like, you can't be subtle about it. But I do think that, we tend to, as outside observers, sort of backseat drive campaigns by looking at what they say. And I think what I have learned about how they approach this in 2020 is that, particularly when you deal with these sort of viral disinformation problems, that their responses are not always saying the thing that they're responding to, right? And that they will be thinking about ways to address, the age issue, specifically among the whatever 8, 10, 11% of the electorate that's persuadable, and moved on that issue through other mechanisms. And I think we need to just, like, every time we talk about persuasion in this campaign, realize what a small slice of the electorate we're dealing with these days in, certainly in presidential politics, but in a lot of statewide politics, and realize how different persuadable voters are from certainly the people who, would read a book like mine or listen to a podcast like yours.
So there's this imbalance, and I want to talk about it from both perspectives with how the two sides look at this issue, look at the disinformation issue. On the Republican side, there is a ton of energy put into how can we manipulate Democratic voters to help us and use these tools to help us, and very little to thinking about how do we defend against this. And on the Democratic side, there's very little energy put into how do we manipulate Republican voters using misinformation tactics to help our candidates, and just a ton of energy put into how do we combat it, right? And so I don't know which side why don't we take the Republican side first, and whether that is a fair summation of your interviews and your research.
Yeah, so I was reporting this mostly over the course of 2022, and I spent most of the time with Democrats or folks on the left, primarily in the U.S. I also did, there's a chapter that's set in Brazil before the first round of voting there, because I think a lot of the dynamics and challenges are very similar. And I didn't set out to write a book about what Democrats are doing to combat disinformation. I wanted, and the Victory Lab, was about both sides, because there was a lot of interesting innovation.
I should have worn my Project Orca sweatshirt for this interview. That was a total miss by me. But Victory Lab was an attempt to look at both sides. It's just the Obama people were better.
Yeah, but I wrote about the Bush campaign in 2004, which had been incredibly innovative on a number of fronts, and So I kept on asking some of the smartest people I knew in Republican politics who would be sort of, most plugged in, like, hey, I'm writing about this counter disinformation stuff and finding all sorts of, Democratic firms that are specializing in this. The DNC has a point person. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee has a point person on this. Like, there are a lot of people in Democratic politics by 2022 whose like business card said counter disinformation strategist. Like, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything like on the right. Like, is there nobody who's doing this? And time again, people will be like, no, we don't do this. And it's because they didn't think of disinformation as a actual category. And folks on the right, and this is actually something that I think pretty much unites the kind of Trumpy, MAGA folks and the kind of establishment, elite, professional Republicans who used to be your friends, Tim.
I know. Sad.
Is that there are sort of united in thinking that disinformation, in quotes, is a concept that Democrats invented in 2017 to explain away losing an election, a presidential election, and that they had begun to use as a predicate for collaborating with government and academia to pressure tech companies to censor conservatives. And there are instances where like some part of that dynamic has played out. It's not entirely baseless as a claim, but it is like they become dismissive of the whole idea that this is a different type of political speech, and I think that shapes both the willingness to participate and contribute to it, but also the view that there's no need to develop a particular mindset or expertise for responding to it, and that remains the case in Republican politics today.
Yeah, it's not baseless; it's exaggerated. But it's not baseless. It's just reality. Like that a lot of part of the reason why Elon took over Twitter is that like there was, more, or like they were taking down more right-wing speech and claims than they were lefty. Now, part of that is because there was more right-wing speech and lies out there, right? And there's more active disinformation. And I think to me, this is what explains it, is that there's more of an intentional effort to manipulate coming from the right than there is from the left. I just think that's an objective fact. And so in some ways, like this is where I get my old Republican rat fucker hat on, which is why I'm kind of like, why? Like, I mean, maybe instead of having a lot of Democrats with business cards that say counter disinformation, there should be Democrats with business cards that say disinformation. They probably wouldn't put it on their business card, but right. Why are they doing it more? And one character from the book, full disclosure, is a friend of the pod, Dimitri Melhorn, works with Reid Hoffman on various projects. He, I think this tension is represented in his actions, right? So in 2017, they led an effort in Alabama to use some of these tactics to tamp down support for Roy Moore. There was some fake news websites targeting conservatives. There was an effort to get conservatives to write in somebody else rather than Roy Moore. None of it, to me, all of it seemed pretty. I thought that there was a lot of ado about not much in my one man's opinion. But it was using some of these tactics that are very frequently used on the right by foreign governments, and the response to that, maybe rightly, was that like, okay, this was maybe too aggressive. Goes against values, and like the Democrats are now trying to figure out spending much more energy and resources on combating it than trying to fight. Is that accurate? Do you think that's
right?
fair?
Yeah. So if you go back to 2017 when this special election in Alabama happened, it was a real open, the menu of options available for Democrats who were just beginning to think about this. It was like really long and open, and
Wild West.
And people were throwing out all sorts of things. One of which was like, well, why don't we, Trump's a big threat. Why don't we fight fire with fire? And why aren't we doing this too? And so some of Hoffman's money ends up funding these two separate projects in Alabama, and they. About a year after the election, the Washington Post and the New York Times end up doing these, sort of investigative stories about the projects, and that identify that Hoffman was a significant funder of both of them. And the response was, among Hoffman, was like a pretty old style response was like, wow, we're getting hit for being hypocrites. This is a bad news cycle because, and look, and Hoffman and Melhorn in particular had spoken pretty high-mindedly about Trump as a threat to democracy, sure. And they had set themselves up as sort of defenders of liberal democracy. And so when you have tactics that seem at odds with that, then like charges of hypocrisy are reasonable to make. And so they were very quickly put out a statement basically that was broad and vague, but basically said, hey, we don't support this with our money. And it short-circuited what had been a very open debate on the left about whether these types of tactics were an appropriate set of tools to be using to fight Trump, because Hoffman had emerged as one of, if not the biggest source of new money in Democratic politics. Basically, everybody in lefty politics, center-right politics, either was getting his money or wanted some of his money at that point. And, Dimitri Melhorn almost single-handedly set a moral code for Democrats that, ended up, being adopted by the big established super PACs, the Democratic Party organizations, because he controlled the purse strings, especially around a lot of sort of, innovative tech-forward political stuff. And so you can find all sorts of Democrats, activists, consultants who will, off the record, say, like, why are saying the same thing they were in 2017? Why aren't we fighting fire with fire? Why are we operating according to like a totally outdated code of how you compete online these days? And the best answer is because of what happened in Alabama in 2017 and the fallout from it. That said, I do really find it hard to imagine, we're now in March of 2024, that if we reconvened in 8 months after Election Day, and assuming that Trump is on the precipice of returning to the White House, that some of those self-enforced moral standards might go out the window, and that we will have seen like a major effort, maybe by a Democratic super PAC, maybe by people who, not by the Biden campaign itself, but to try to apply some of these tactics to defeat him.
Okay, we're going to move through just a couple other things before I lose you, Sasha. TikTok, just really briefly, obviously there's a lot of discussion about this. On the policy side, we'll be talking about that more. I'm more interested in hearing from you. And it is like even more of a black box than all of these other sites, right? So at least with Twitter, or Facebook, like there's a link. You can get an individualized link for everything. And it's like pretty, like relatively easy to get. TikTok is like, every once in a while I'll be scrolling through my For You page and there'll be something that's just totally made up that has 900,000 views. You've never heard of the person. You've never seen this. I just think that the what is happening on there, how to monitor it is very challenging. So how are these guys looking at that? Like, how do you monitor this? I mean, at least on the other stuff, it was opaque, but doable. I just don't know if it's even doable to monitor the information that's on TikTok.
I don't think it conventionally is. And I'll throw into the mix the other place that people in campaigns are worried about this year are private messaging apps.
Yes.
WhatsApp is a great example, especially in immigrant communities, where it has turned into a kind of weird hybrid of like a broadcast platform and a group text, but sometimes you'll have thousands of people, tens of thousands of people.
I was doing a Lynn Wood story. Remember that clown who was pushing the election fraud? I was writing about him back in 21, and his, I think it was Signal. I'd have to go back and look at it. But it had like 100,000 followers on it or something like that. And it was you have to subscribe to it or you couldn't see it.
Yeah, you have to subscribe, be approved, invite only. And so, one of the things that I write about the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, like one of the things they've started doing when they send a field organizer out, and they're particularly focused on this in like Southern California, where you have large Asian communities that are particularly relying on these community WhatsApp channels, South Florida, where Latino voters are, is they tell the field organizer, not just like open up an office, order some pizza, get your volunteers in and train them, but go meet people and just ask to get into all the private Facebook groups, into all the WhatsApp groups, and send reports to Washington on what's moving there every day. Because just like TikTok, there is no way for an outsider to peek in. You have to become an insider.
Oh, that's a good active. A lot of times we get people that are like, "What should I do? What can I do in my community? Infiltrate the WhatsApp feeds in your community and report up to the campaign."
Absolutely.
That's something to do. Okay. Lastly, on this topic, and I have two other really quick things off the topic of this book is Giori Craig is a character you close the book with, disinformation worker on the Democratic side. It ends pretty pessimistic, frankly, about the state of affairs. And so how dark are the Democrats just about whether this is even a solvable thing at this point?
Yeah, so she started doing this.
Maybe too big of a word, but even an addressable is maybe a better word.
Yeah, so Jory Craig was the main character of the book, started doing this in 2017. And over the course of the time I spent with her, she grew more and more fatalistic, I think, about whether the stuff she was doing was having a major impact. I think that she feels like Democrats have gotten better at tracking and making some of the assessments we talked about and making the decisions about how and when to respond. But the scope of the problem is getting worse, largely because the platforms are more actively disdainful of the idea that it's their job to deal with this. And so,
and literally in the case of Twitter, we could have done a whole episode on Elon Musk, but it's just worth saying that like that is, he is not only is not interested in combating disinformation, he seems actively interested in advancing disinformation.
Yes, that's right. And like the Jim Jordan hearings in the House, Republican attorneys general are suing tech companies. It's all scaring other companies like Facebook in particular, Meta, who had at least sort of made gestures to caring about this because they were concerned about basically drawing regulatory interest in Washington. Now they see far more cost in antagonizing Republicans than there is upside in staving off regulation. So I could come up with some scenarios where maybe things turn in a different direction in 2 years or 4 years because of things that happen in Washington, because of things that happen in Silicon Valley. But I think the near term outlook is this is becoming a harder problem to solve, and all the tools that Democrats have developed are giving them some good tactics at sort of mitigation and response, but not to like wrestle the problem in its entirety.
My advice to Democratic policymakers in DC is to focus more on algorithm regulation and just creating rules around how they can do it. Because like doing the whack-a-mole with individual content, it does look bad. It's a bad look. It's a bad look if a company is just deleting information from one side. Even if it's fair, it's still a bad look. And like the big problem for me is the algorithms. It's so bad on Twitter now that like if you quote tweet somebody to dunk on them, like then your algorithm just gets fed crazier and crazier shit like by friends of the person that you dunked on. Right. And so it helps them expand. And we talked about this a little bit at the start. And so it's like they're actively and then TikTok with the For You page and the more they move to algorithmically delivered information versus follower to follower information. To me, it's kind of like, okay, if one follower wants to post false shit to their followers, like that's bad, but maybe unsolvable. Like the algorithm thing feels like the addressable issue. Okay. Lastly, you did write an 800-page book about gay marriage. And you kind of wrote it at this time where really maybe, hopefully not forever, but maybe at the peak of the strength of the gay rights movement, really, and I think that there's been clearly some backsliding between the Don't Say Gay. There hasn't been backsliding on gay marriage really, but on the Don't Say Gay bills, things of this nature. So anyway, I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that 3 years out. Do you feel the same way you did about the Victory Lab, that maybe you're in a moment and that things were, you didn't expect that things would get like this? You saw it coming. I'm curious for some big gay thoughts from you before we end.
So I think I was naive in part because, and you made this distinction in passing, but let me dwell on it, separating the politics of marriage and the legal stature of marriage and a whole bunch of other issues of immediate concerns of the LGBT community.
Yep.
And there had been, this internal debate I write about throughout the book among gay rights activists about how much to focus on marriage versus focusing on hate crimes or employment protection or AIDS funding or a bunch of things.
Sure.
And the argument that the people who want to focus on marriage made was marriage will lift all boats. That this is like it focuses on our relationships, on who we are, this sort of central thing, and hate crimes is secondary, and it's about protection. If we can convince a majority of Americans that our relationships are the same and interchangeable and as theirs, that will be a foundation on which all of our other political goals related to anti-discrimination and such will be built. And I thought that was a pretty persuasive argument. Same. And so when I write this book came out in 2021, and I was writing it through the Supreme Court decisions, I did think that that the progress on marriage would extend to other issues. And I saw a anti-gay part of the social conservative movement seemingly lose their interest in fighting over gay rights issues. Yeah. They got very weak. Some of the organizations, like the National Organization for Marriage, that were big players, barely exist anymore. Other religious right groups started focusing on other things. I think in retrospect, I realized a lot of this was Donald Trump, that he in 2016 signaled, hey, I have a lot of groups I want to pick on: immigrants, Muslims, Mexicans, women, but did not give an indication that, the targeting and even personally seems less invested, frankly, in the trans stuff. Obviously, there are a lot of people around him who are, but I do think that Trump basically suppressed a lot of the anti-LGBT politics in his party over 4 years. And when he left the scene, a lot of that returned to the surface. And what had happened quietly, but I cover this at the end of my book, but probably not in enough depth and context, is the way in which the anti-gay rights activists realized, even before the cases came to the Supreme Court, that they were going to lose this. And they started redirecting their energy and attention and infrastructure and money towards the anti-trans stuff.
And schools. Go back to the old shit. Yeah.
Yeah. Really retro,
70s
vintage.
Are back.
Yeah. Overseas stuff. You see a lot of the people who were fighting gay rights in the US in the 2000s up to 2010 are now in Zambia trying to change their laws to keep gay sex criminalized. And so what I had not realized is the extent to which the clear defeat for them on marriage did not mark a sort of permanent, giving up on gay rights, but that they had sort of tactically gone to places where public opinion is better for them. Gay marriage still polls over 70%.
Yeah.
Over 50% of Republicans approve it. And basically professional Republicans realize this is not a smart place to play, but we can find a whole lot of issues around sexual politics and the LGBT community that still are popular, and where we can be on the front foot defining the conflict instead of reacting to it. And I think that we're going to see a lot of this around the parents' rights and gender identity issues for years, decades to come.
It's really smart. I'm glad I asked about that. Okay, Sasha Issenberg, The Lie Detectives in Search of a Playbook for Winning Elections. You can read it in an afternoon, so go get it. The Engagement, you can read it in a decade. Go get that as well. If you care about the fight for gay marriage, appreciate being on the Bulwark Podcast, brother.
Love you, man. Good to see you.